all the tests are and what the journey is from associates to the professional and what your options are in professional. And again, we'll kind of take a deeper dive and double click into the associates test to kind of give you, some idea of where you may want to start and to kind of prepare you, for a study. Familiar with DevNet, that is a team within Cisco that currently is now under CX, which used to be our advanced services, and now CX is customer experience, and they're a special business unit that focuses on enablement for programmability and also for working with ecosystem partners of Cisco. So if there's a partner that's developing an application and if they need access to resources so that they can develop against our APIs, then DevNet provides sandboxes for that purposes, as well as sandboxes for us to use to study and to prepare for certifications and for our own learning purposes. We have access to these remote sandboxes, this DevNet track. And within DevNet, there's the associates level, which is a single test. And that's the one that I had on my slide that I took that's a single test, but it's not a prerequisite. So what they did is, instead of having CCNA that you would have to take in order to take the CCNP, with DevNet, you can take it or not. You can start with a specialist test, which is really just one of the sub-tests, or what they call the core technology options from the DevNet professional. And specializations are more for partners because they're required to have certain specializations to sell certain products. But for individual certifications, really the professional is probably the main focal point right now, until the day comes when they have the DevNet CCIE, which does not exist yet. But the goal is to have that available within the next year or so. And just focusing on the associates level, if you're just starting out in certifications and you're fairly new to Cisco, you may have a background in computer science or programmability, and a lot of the curriculum that you'll need to learn here will be fairly straightforward, but there is some level of networking skills as well that could be new for somebody starting out on the DevNet track. So they say it's about 80% software and developmental skills, and then 20% just core networking skills, where CCNA is the opposite. And that's something that's new for the CCNA, is that 20% of it now has automation and programmability as part of a CCNA. So it's really just a different starting point. If you're new, completely new to networking, then obviously the CCNA is a huge challenge for you because you're building like all those foundational skills, and you may have never had any programmability. So that's something that could be completely new for someone starting out in the network side of things. And it's just flip-flopped here as well. But more than likely, a lot of folks that are attempting the DevNet have some programmability background, but that's not always the case. So this could be challenging, even though it's an associate's level for you, if you're completely new to APIs, programmability, and tools like Python. And we're going to hone in a little bit on that today with the time that we have. But those are skills that if you're even a more advanced network engineer, if it's brand new for you, you're going to have a little bit of a learning curve to take on some of these skills to get started. But then once you get the foundation, then you'll be able to move on to professional and the expert level if you desire, once that's available. And it shouldn't be a problem. It's just taking on new skills. This is kind of the big picture of this test, and you can get to this slide from this link here. This is the main sections, and when you have your report of the certification, once you complete, you'll see what percentage you had in each one of these sections. You'll see that they're not weighted exactly the same. Depending on how long ago you thought about the OSI model and just basic Ethernet stuff and basic routing, some of the stuff might throw you off guard, so you might want to just take a look, depending on how rusty some of those things are. So a couple of slides just on some basic API foundational skills that you're going to have to look into, and then we'll apply it to some of the different tools like Postman and Python and even some Ansible. You might see some of that as well. But from basics of APIs, this example here is from one of the DevNet express tracks that we have out there. So I just grabbed this slide, and it's not networking related. It's just Google Maps, but it's a pretty good model to look at just to kind of understand what's going on here. So if you look at a URI, that is what you're requesting. And that terminology here is kind of familiar too. It's what you're requesting, the URI part of it. And there's different pieces of this. So obviously you have the server or host is what you're pointing to an API, but then in that request, and that would allude to a get that we'll talk about what the actions are for those methods. But in that request, you have the resources. So as you move into a resource, it starts out like a tree, right? So you could have a request that's just kind of generic to a particular resource, and then you can go a step further and leverage filters and things like that that are part of parameters that you can set for like specific information that you're requesting. So this looks a lot different depending on what API you're pointing it to. A Nexus API as opposed to DNA Center, so you're going to have to look into some of the products that are a part of the blueprint, and they may look a little bit different, but at a high level, it's all kind of the same thing. They're probably going to have you key into different components that you're filtering, as part of that URI. So that's kind of the high level of a request. Now, if you make a request, you're going to receive some information back. So the way that a RESTful API works is that you're receiving serialized data, right, back from the API, and that would be in the form of either XML or JSON. So this is just a JSON dictionary here. So these are just key values, right? So it's just data coming back, structured data coming back. But what happens is you request using that URI format, and then when you receive the response, the payload of that HTTP packet is this, either JSON payload or XML payload. That's what happens when you request and you receive a response. Now, there's other actions like post, put, and patch. That means that we're sending information that also has a payload. So the body of that particular post would have a payload in it. And more than likely, because we're talking about network automation, that payload is some sort of configuration that we're sending to either a controller's API or a network device's API. And there's different APIs that we'll talk about briefly as well. But the main thing is that you understand that you request through the URI, the response has a payload, and if you're creating something, as is the case with post, then you would have a payload, because you have to tell that API what you want to do, and that would be a part of the payload. There's also headers and other information like the content type, specifically in a header. That's where we say if we prefer JSON or XML format. And you could, if we look back at that other example, I forgot to point out that was JSON in the request, right? So we'll take a deeper dive into what the headers look like. This is just one of the headers, but you set the content type because you may prefer looking at JSON as opposed to XML. So XML is also dictionaries, but you have these tags, and it kind of hurts your eyes because it's all over the place. You have tags and closing tags, and your values in the middle of the tags. For me, it's a lot easier just to look at JSON. So I tend to navigate to JSON if I have that option. If you request information and it's valid, you'll receive a 200 OK. If you do a get and whatever, you're authenticated, everything's good, and it's a valid request, you'll have a 200 OK. If you're using your post and creating something, then a 201 means that whatever that object was, you created it successfully, and you'll get that response back. Now, when you start having issues like you're asking for something that is not a valid object in whatever that API is, then that's where you start receiving like a 400 as a bad request, as an example. If you forget to authenticate, or if you have invalid credentials, 401. 403 is more like authorization. So if in that RBAC doesn't allow you to some access to some object, then you could have a forbidden. And then if you're asking for something that doesn't exist, then that's a 404. Anything in the 500 range is usually something to do with the load balancer or the actual hardware failing from whatever that API is, if it's a controller, or it just depends on clients or whatever it is, or it could have a load balancer in front of it, then you're going to receive these 500 errors. So here's an internal server error, 500 and 503, service unavailable. And then in the other, not in this level of a test, but in the next one, professional layer, they go a little bit deeper into these because there's a bunch of different like back-offs and things like that. But one that you do want to look at that they don't have here is the 300 section, and the one in the 300s is a redirect.